Thank you very much for being able to join us this afternoon. I wondered if you could please start by just providing a brief summary of your professional expertise in the area of balancing religious and cultural freedoms with the protection of women from all forms of discrimination.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me to take part in the proceedings. My name is Yasmin Rehman. I've been working in the Advance Against Women and Girls and anti-racism sector for 35 years. I've worked in the statutory sector, the voluntary and community sectors, and as an independent consultant and researcher, both in the UK and overseas. For the last 10 years, I have been researching polygamy and temporary marriage amongst British Muslims. I'm often called on as an expert witness in cases of faith-based abuse, honour-based abuse, forced marriage, and wider issues around violence against women and children in Black and minority communities.
Thank you. For the benefit of the judges, Ms. Rehman has provided a witness statement, which is at number 223 in the bundle, and there are a number of supporting documents that follow the witness statement. There are two main issues that we would like to ask you questions on this afternoon, please. The first one being polygamous marriages and the second being religious-only marriages. Mm-hmm. Based on your experience and research, can you explain how widespread the practice of polygamous marriage is in the UK?
I think the honest answer to that is that we just don't know. I think it's incredibly difficult to gather any data, one because of the invisibility, but also the irregularity of the forms that polygamy and temporary marriages take. And I think these arrangements challenge our current understanding of the family and also what constitutes marriage. So in some of the cases, and I've interviewed now more than 100 men and women who are either in these unions themselves or have grown up in polygamous households, you will have situations where you will have multiple wives living together in one household, others where they are living in separate households, and the husband of the women will stay at different points of time with each wife or reside with one. You have others where it doesn't, to all intents and purposes, it's not where you just have the husband visiting on occasion, staying overnight and then leaving, but for significant periods of time he will not be there. And then there's also throwing in temporary marriages into the mix. So I think it's really difficult. There's also the issue of at which point do you define a marriage as polygamous? Is it when both parties are aware that there is another spouse in the mix? And if that's a temporary marriage, is that truly polygamous, or is it, depending on the length of it, given that temporary marriages can last anywhere from a few hours to several months? So I think definition is really, really challenging, and I think we need to find ways of researching and speaking to women and men about their experiences of it, and that would require some investment of time and resources.
And are you, in your experience, is the UK government investing that time and resources into researching this question?
I think the UK government, like many governments across the world, are turning a blind eye to this. If polygamy is ever mentioned, it's mentioned in the context of immigration or welfare benefit issues. And given the research that I've done, that's not always the case. There were many of those I've spoken to have entered into a polygamous union where you have two British nationals, both residing in the UK, so immigration never comes into it, and they're both working, so they're not claiming state benefits. There's also the complication of British nationals who've gone overseas and married a foreign national in a country where polygamy is recognised, or they've married someone who is not a British national in this country, but in a religious-only marriage. So it's, I think it's in the too difficult box for the government, because I think this issue goes to the very heart of the whole issue of, is there a hierarchy of human rights, and does the freedom of religion trump the freedom from abuse and freedom from violence and freedom from torture, which from my research, I think this is a really harmful practice.
Could you just expand upon the nature of the harm caused to women and children in polygamous or temporary marriages?
I think this goes to the very heart of violence against women and girls. Where you have younger women who will be married to much older men, so there's that issue of child marriage where the links are. I've clearly, in some of the women that I've spoken to, there's a clear link to trafficking and prostitution, where a wife will be brought over from overseas and then trafficked into this country through that route, and then prostituted and exploited that way. There's the economic issues of spreading resources ever more thinly across a larger and larger and expanding family. The issue of the subordination of women and the disposability of women. As a practicing Muslim, I find this really challenging. The Quran quite clearly states that there are, specific reasons for that a man can state in which he enters into a further union, and that is if the woman is infertile, if she's unwell, if she fails to produce a male heir, or she fails to, adhere to her marital duties, which includes sexual availability. And I think that just reinforces and reproduces gender inequality at every step.
Could you explain the scope of the current bigamy laws in the UK, please?
So bigamy laws, at the moment, you will have committed bigamy if you enter into more than one legally recognised marriage, so a civil marriage, a marriage that the state recognises. Polygamous marriages, I think, in those communities, and it's not just Muslims, but my research is predominantly with Muslims in Britain, are exploiting that legal loophole. So where there may be one civil marriage that has taken place, and then subsequent marriages take place either in religious only or customary services. The bigamy laws don't cover or will not impact upon those families currently entering into polygamous or temporary unions.
How would or could incorporation of CEDAW into domestic law offer enhanced protection for women and girls from polygamous marriage? And off the back of that, what recommendations would you have as to how the UK government ought to be addressing this issue?
I think CEDAW is very clear about polygamy, and that's why I've contributed to the shadow report and the additional recommendations from the women's sector. I think in terms of whether we look at Article 16 and ensuring that women have equal rights with men in all aspects of family and married life, there are Article 21, 28 and 29. So I think CEDAW is very clear on this. And I think incorporating it into domestic law is one step, but I think we also have to be careful not to put all our eggs in one basket. We have legislation, we've got the Equality Duty, we have legislation for rape, the Domestic Abuse Act, the previous speaker spoke about, forced marriage, FGM, etc. But legislation alone will not be the answer. We have to ensure that there are specialist services there to support those affected. We have to ensure that there is monitoring. We've got to ensure that that legislation is part of a set of tools that are available to protect those who are most vulnerable. And I absolutely think it's a step in the right direction, but we can't do that in isolation from ensuring that we have specialist services in place to protect those as well. And a clear stance as well from the government, a clear statement of what their position is on this issue, because that's not clear, certainly not to me, in terms of their view of polygamy at this particular point.
Thank you. Moving on, if we may, to the linked issue of non-registered or religious-only marriages. Please, can you explain, to start with, the issues of concern that you've identified in relation to religious-only marriages in the UK?
I think we're seeing a very cynical manipulation of marriage, and that is, I think, through these religious marriages, and also the establishment of parallel legal systems and religious courts, which operate very much like courts. So there's been an increasing push towards conservative fundamentalist interpretations of certainly of Islamic practice. There's I've certainly seen an increase in community policing and space for action that women have. So women are entering in, because the only way that women can have a religiously sanctioned, community accepted sexual relationship is through the institution of marriage. So entering into a marriage, albeit as a second or third or fourth wife, if you're a widow, if you're divorced, or if you're not seen as valuable for whatever other reason. And then also having to, on the dissolution of that marriage, or even the death of a spouse, having to then seek redress through these very same religious courts, I think has created huge difficulties for women and minority women, Muslim women particularly, and left them at the risk of these very conservative patriarchal structures within communities who will hand out pronouncements, often in terms of child custody. Custody will be handed over to fathers. I've interviewed many women who've lost their children through these religious courts, delivering a judgment that the child should be handed over to the father, not being able to claim property rights, not being able to claim pension rights, not being able to claim inheritance rights.
How is the UK tackling the issue of religious-only marriages?
The government had an inquiry into Sharia courts several years ago, which would have been an opportunity to actually do something. But I think the government absolutely failed. The voices of some religious leaders carried huge amounts of weight, and I think time and again the government just acquiesces to religious leaderships and is afraid, and that goes back to that point I made about how do you balance gender equality and religious freedom. I think it goes back to that very issue, and not wanting to be involved in so-called community issues, which leaves some of the most vulnerable members of our community at huge risk of harm.
There was a recent consultation last year on marriage law. Did that look at any of these issues of polygamous marriages and religious-only marriages?
I think the consultation again was a huge disappointment. It was more about the venues in which marriages could take place, and also those who were able to conduct marriages. It didn't go to the heart of the issue, which I think is about what is a legal marriage, what constitutes a legal marriage, and what is the process in which those marriages are conducted. It was, I think it was very disappointing. Bringing it out, having the consultation during the coronavirus pandemic, when specialist women's services were stretched to breaking point. And I say that as chief exec of a women's organisation in the East Midlands. I'm quite cynical about the timing of it all as well. And I think the consultation absolutely failed to grapple some of the issues around forced marriage, coercion into marriage, this loophole between religious marriage and civil marriage.
Again, with reference to provisions of CEDAW, are you able to identify any specific provisions that, if CEDAW were incorporated into domestic law, would require the government to add protections and look at these issues more closely?
I mean, I've already mentioned Article 16, but I think Article 21 and 29, in terms of, those protections in marriage. So I'd like to see civil marriage having to happen first and foremost. And I think CEDAW gives us, in terms of, giving the government something to hang this issue on. I think General Recommendation 31 is very, very clear about polygamy, and that's one that I think the government could certainly have recourse to. I think CEDAW recognises the difficulties of customary practices and religious practices, but also the state's duties in terms of protecting its citizens. So I think CEDAW has a role to play in moving forward, but I again have to stress, if we're going to have more legislation and this is going to be incorporated, then the recommendations from the shadow report the women's sector put forward about monitoring, about specialist services, about strengthening the implementation of existing laws, as well as the incorporation of CEDAW,